and I'd like to welcome all of you, those of you who have braved the elements to be here. Paradigm Capital has followed small cap companies in technology and other sectors for the past 20 years. The last few years have been quite dramatic in that I think a lot of companies in the small cap Canadian market have been made notorious for underperformance because the indices have lagged the global market so badly. What's behind that, though, is a consistent and long history of innovation, entrepreneurialism, and that is epitomized by all of the people who will be presenting to you today. Beginning with a panel on cannabis and and the effects of psychedelic drugs to Patriot missiles and armaments, oncology, agriculture, blockchain, and just about everything in between. So the list of companies presenting, I think, again, epitomize all of those attributes that we think have been demonstrated on the Canadian markets, even if the listed markets have not performed to expectations. But behind that are all of the examples of invention and innovation we think that you will see on display today. Most of all, besides being edified, educated, and entertained, we want to leave you with ideas that make you money. And that is the objective of what we do for a living, following the companies we do. We have some of our research here just to advertise for Paradigm Capital. Our analysts who follow the key sectors on display here are roaming around and will be presenting today. Kevin Krishnaratna will be leading a panel today on the connected world, which I think is extremely interesting. And we'll have our analysts presenting on the clinical aspects of the cannabis industry, which is where we are focusing most of our time, along with some of the rec world, which is obviously has been dominating the news. Kate Hayes, one of my colleagues, will be introducing the next panel, and I hope you enjoy all of the content over the next 2 days. It's a pleasure for us to sponsor this stage, and thank you for attending.
Moderated by Danny Lipkin, who's the Innovation Sector Head at TMX Group. And we have Nick Pateris from Lift & Co., Prad Sakar from KB2 Insights, and Sean Muniz from Cannabis CanTech.
Morning there. Glad to see everybody got through the snow okay, because this is a very important discussion that we're going to have here today. So for those of you who have yet to meet, my name is Danny Lipkin. I head up the innovation sector on the TSX, which includes life sciences under my auspices, which includes cannabis, and the tie-in also to technology with big data. So I'll let the panelists first introduce themselves, a bit of their biography and their companies and what they're doing in the space. And I'll start to my immediate right. Sean?
I'm Sean Muniz, CEO of Cannabis CanTech. Our company launched on the CSC July of last summer, so we're a bit young, about a year and a half into the markets, and we're a cannabis data and analytics company. And so the two greatest needs we saw last year was education and cannabis analytics, and we built a multitude of products that are in market right now. We have an education platform, a pet platform, and cannabis analytics, providing deep sets of data to LPs, dispensaries, Health Canada, and whatnot. And before we started the company, I worked about 5 years in the health sciences space with Click Health, building patient-centric platforms, and before that, about 9 years with Pitney Bowes, building out their geospatial technology. So it's a good marriage between CRM technology and the healthcare space, geared up for the cannabis space right now.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick Pateris. I serve as VP Strategy at Lift & Co. We've been trading on the Venture Exchange since September the 17th. Lift & Co. is a media and technology company in the cannabis space, exclusively focused on the cannabis space. We've been around, started as a website 6 years ago, and then evolved into essentially a marketing solutions platform for licensed producers and retailers who are somewhat blocked out from marketing their products or their brands to consumers. So essentially we play in the intersection of consumers, retailers, and licensed producers across all of our verticals. That's events, our data insights, our content and web services, as well as our training solutions too. My background is in pharmaceuticals. I spent some time at Johnson & Johnson a few years before making the move into cannabis about 2 years ago, and excited to be here today.
Good morning. My name is Brad Shaker. I'm the co-founder and CEO of CB2 Insights. Wouldn't be the perfect trio if we run all data and analytics companies. I co-founded the company back in 2014. Our background comes from primary healthcare. For those who still say that there's not enough evidence behind cannabis as a medicine, that's effectively what we are aiming to solve. So we're a data aggregator. We're building a data asset of what we call as real-world evidence, clinically led data systems. So we operate, currently our business is primarily based out of the US. We operate the largest network of clinics, medical centers that actually focus on cannabinoid therapy. Where we have proprietary technology systems that we actually use standardized protocols from research literature around the world to basically take patients through what we call as real-world clinical trials, effectively looking at current health models of different patients in different demographics and sectors, and then assessing those against outcomes from a very clinically validated methodology. Our goal is to obviously take this data, and we're now starting to work with stakeholders outside of North America to basically aim to educate the clinical world, educate the medical community around the efficacy of cannabis while clinical trials are still not fully available from a real-world evidence perspective.
Great. So, as Val mentioned, it's a very nascent industry. It's something that's only been around for a few years. When we think back to the first public cannabis company, it was only just under 5 years ago now. It's evolved. We have a lot of licensed producers out there, but now we're starting to get into more of the data questions and the data issues. So how reliable would you say the current data is in the industry? A lot of people have pointed to StatsCan as some official publication of it, but how reliable is that data? How can it be enhanced from a public transparency standpoint in Canada?
I'll take a stab at it. So the data that we have now looks more on the transactional side. So as you mentioned, LPs have grown. I think in 2017 we had around 50, now we're at 155. And so it's an interesting shift that the market is going through where it's not about transactions, it's about who's on the other side of that transaction. Why are they on the other side of transactions? Looking at the consumer behavioral trends and trying to understand why did that person make that purchase in the first place. So before you're going from very transactional and a very agricultural type of industry, where in 2019, it's the retail market, it's about branding. And so you have this interesting shift from farm to brand. And so part of the data that we have, in my opinion, would be just scratching the point right now of the infancy of the cannabis market around data acquisitions, looking at different consumer spends, and as you guys mentioned on the behavioral side, and looking at education and evidence-based solutions. So I'd say we're just pretty much at that tipping point at this stage right now.
I was going to say, even from, we've talked about clinical evidence that's kind of lacking there. Like, how do you, there's a constraint in the industry, there's just a lack of clinical evidence at this point. Like, how are you trying to overcome that? How are you working with medical professionals to try and solve for those issues that, people want to look to hard data, but they can't find it necessarily yet, right?
But as you start to ask the bigger questions around the validity of that data, sometimes it's hard to trace that data back to the diagnosis of the patient or some of the let's call it more standardized, rigorous test scorecards that have been used in other verticals of healthcare. And the way we always like to say it is, if cannabis wants to play in the same sandbox as the rest of medications, it really needs to be treated the same way. So working with health professionals is critical. In our experience, we've always found it hard to standardize working with third-party clinicians because everyone's got necessarily their own rhythm and their own way and processes. So our background really has been around creating our own data sets, challenges with us rolling up and acquiring more clinics and growing our networks currently in the US, and we're starting to look internationally with that, is it allows us to be able to put standardized protocols. And when we say standardized protocols, it's not something we're creating. We're looking at research from around the world. We're looking at research from Tilray. We're looking at protocols from universities. We're looking at Tilray. We're looking at various other larger groups that have taken products through stage 1 to stage 4 clinical trials and are looking at taking those same metrics and applying that to cannabis. Because when you, at the end of the day, want to present information to a community that's used to hearing something and prescribing something for many, many years, it needs to be in the same fashion. And that's at least the way we take it.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think embedded within the question about data reliability is what the data is being used for. So obviously, I mean, data integrity is paramount to any data solutions provider. But I think, for instance, if we think about market share, like I take any market share numbers that I see today with a mountain of salt because you've got a really slow rollout of retail stores. You've got none of these LPs operating at maximum capacity. I mean, essentially, the market is still finding its legs. So the idea of market share, for example, when I see those numbers are, I treat them as directional at best. Beyond the fact that any data provider, even coming out of the US, that's talking about transactional data, the penetration rates are, below 15%. So the extrapolation is quite high. On our side, when we talk about our reviews, for example, the need we were trying to solve when we launched our review platform was patients went and spoke to a physician, they wrote you a prescription or medical authorization for a specific LP, which when I came in from the traditional healthcare space, it was quite eye-opening because you don't usually get an authorization for an entire company, you get it for a specific molecule or a specific compound. So we realized there was a need in that last mile of the purchase journey for patients to help them understand the experiences of others, learn from the empirical healthcare experiences of others using cannabis products, and so that's why we launched our review platform. Now, is that the same as a clinical trial, a phase 2, phase 3, placebo-controlled, mass-conducted trial? No, but it is the best that we have available today. So that's kind of why we do what we do, because we recognize that data is only as good as the purpose it's intended to serve.
So you talk about a bit of that challenge that it's so early. There's thousands of strains, thousands of different ways to ingest. Is this a challenge or an opportunity that you all kind of see in the marketplace that, we're still early days of tracking this data, seeing how it all affects, where the challenges and opportunities lie as you look at all this potential available data that will come in the years?
Let me take a stab at that. So what we've seen in some of the early inklings of the data is if someone goes on medical cannabis, the decisions that led up to them educating themselves, getting over that stigma, talking to their healthcare practitioner is just as important as the strain that they're on, their method of ingestion, and how that fits their lifestyle. So I'll use an example for an athlete, and let's pretend for the moment that CBD patches are around. It seems like a method of ingestion that is rightly fit for an athlete. Someone that would have muscle fatigue or would use that patch while they're training. If you're looking at someone that has rheumatoid arthritis, a topical cream is something that may or may not be the best method of ingestion. So where you're going from dry leaf and using CBD oil now, like you mentioned, there's a bunch of different ingestion methods, and it's key to look at what that person is trying to get out of using medical cannabis, the conversations they're having with their doctor, and then informed decisions of holding that patient's hand and taking them along that patient journey. And so you have to bridge the two where it's not just around, great, they're on medical cannabis, they're using dry leaf, and they're using 5 grams per week. It's all the ancillary data beforehand that informs that purchase pattern, and that is where I think that golden nugget of data is going to be in 2019, is really understanding that user behavior pattern.
Yeah, I think Sean hit it when he said patient journey. I think it's critical. I think most people think of cannabis and data as I've now received a prescription, or I go buy my product, and then everything I report on it after is effectively all the data that helps navigate these plethora of strains or different ingestion methods and so forth. I think the patient journey starts much earlier, and I think any data company that's focused on aggregating data in the cannabis industry is doing very well, but collectively would do much better understanding the entire patient journey across the entire space. And I think it's eventually leveraging that data together to be able to understand where each of us are focused on data aggregation. And ultimately, I think, to your point, we'll answer a lot of questions, but I think we're still a little bit of ways away from that.
Yeah, and you start to realize all the different types of data sets that can be married against one another. I mean, if you think about the usage and attitudes that a patient overcomes or leans into to initiate a conversation with their doctor, then the authorization they get, then also the dosage, the efficacy, the repeat purchase or the repeat medical authorization. I mean, you're talking about such a vast swath of data. So it's all about how we depixelate the entire patient journey, to your point, and marry all the different data sets, because there's hundreds and hundreds across that journey. How do we combine and conflate them all so that we understand from start to finish, end to end, what the patient journey actually is?
So are you finding that you're all learning lessons from other industries as they evolve and how they use big data, studied it, in changing how the course of your businesses are working itself, or are you learning lessons from other industries and how they utilize big data? This is still early on stages. Have there been lessons at all?
Multiple stuff I wanted to. So my experience with Pitney Bowes when we use big data is looking at the three key pillars of big data. It's high volume, high velocity, and high variety. And before, where you had a small data set, transactionally based, and you knew that everything's masked because of PII, but you have someone here, John Smith, that is getting cannabis. But why? And again, it starts to beg the question, does it matter on their demographic data, the firmographic data? What type of other data overlays can we go about? And so the shift is now going towards what type of ancillary data can you piece together to truly understand who your end customer is. Where at one time you used to have close to almost 700 strains, and now there's a retraction. And now they're saying CBD oil's the new gold. So in 2 years, how much will strains actually be relevant if the method of ingestions are slowly going towards topical creams, patches, and CBD oil, which is non-strain specific. So it's an interesting shift. The data, I agree, is at infancy, understanding the patient journey, learning of why they made that behavioral choice in the first place, and tying all those different data sets together. That's what the retail market in 2019 is going to be, because at the end of the day, if everybody's selling hamburgers and you're trying to do McDonald's, Arby's, or Burger King, you have to actually treat the customer, know your target market, and apply some traditional marketing tactics to this industry that is now in the shift.
Are you finding that lessons you might learn domestically, being Canada, you can apply in the US, apply globally? Are you finding similar trends in the data sets on a global basis, or is this something we're still trying to learn about?
I mean, from our perspective, when we look at, so we play primarily in the medical space, and when we look internationally, most markets will always evolve as a medical market first. And one of the greatest barriers to evolution of any market that opens internationally is the adoption by the clinical community, because they are the bottleneck in most cases for getting patients through the system so they can effectively purchase product. And from an efficacy standpoint, I don't think we've necessarily recognized that there's demographical shifts to the way cannabis can be understood by the community from a risk perspective, contraindications, dosing guidelines, etc. But I think we're still relatively early days. I think when we look internationally, the number of patients coming to market are still fairly small and slim compared to the U.S. or compared to Canada, just from the time that they've had to evolve those markets. So, currently, I'd say from what we see, there's few variances, but that might change over time.
So I think where the efficacy, where the data has value across geographies is the consumption patterns and the efficacy scorecards. To your point, I mean, the fact that we have amassed so much empirical data on how patients use cannabis for medical symptoms or conditions, and how they say it works or doesn't work for them, to the extent that we're essentially one of the largest exporters of medical cannabis in the world. Those products are making their way into other markets, and we can say, well, we have data on how they've been effective for our Canadian patients, so it helps propel the conversation in those other jurisdictions forward. So we're a leader in that sense, because we have a wealth of data on exactly how those products have been used, where they worked, when they didn't, and it helps when you speak to policymakers. We do that a fair bit in other markets. And we're able to show them what our data sets actually reveal, and help them understand how medical cannabis should be considered a serious form of treatment and a legitimate medicine.
So 2018, we always like to joke, was the year of ABC in the public markets: artificial intelligence, blockchain, cannabis. There were other industries that went public, but that seemed to be dominating the retail space for a lot of people. How would you say that those technologies are kind of all coming together in the space that you play? Is artificial intelligence being more and more incorporated into how you're sending out big data from a predictive learning aspect, and being able to, maybe rightly help cannabis patients longer term and understanding, the journey, the path and the journey from earlier on in the process? Do you find that artificial intelligence will be playing a bigger role longer term in the cannabis space globally?
Yeah, I do. I definitely think AI will have its space in the sector. I think in some areas of cannabis and its verticals sooner than later. I think the challenge with AI is you're depicting predictive modeling and formulations based on questions you're trying to answer. And from the last 4 years of evolving our company in the space, people don't necessarily know the right questions to ask yet. And I think as they get closer to understanding the right questions to ask, data is only useful when you know how to answer, when you want to answer the right question. And so when you're depicting formulations, you're trying to create predictive models based on answering solutions, and you're looking at turning those into AI applications so that they're continuously learning and building off each other. I think it will definitely become more important, I think, as stakeholders start to ask all the right questions.
Yep, I agree. And piggybacking off that, as you mentioned, now that you have multiple different data sets, and it's almost the difference of how do you distinguish between AI and machine learning. You hear a lot of those buzzwords being termed around, but looking for patterns, but also understanding what people are learning. And so with our education platform, we're constantly asking the user questions of what their dislikes and likes are, lifestyle choices, understanding all those different types of data sets to go into that predictive analytics. And I think AI's been around for years, and usually during technology conferences or when there's a big showcase in the industry, it resurfaces and people talk about it. But nowadays, when you're going for online support, you don't know if that customer service agent is a chatbot, is it powered by AI, is it someone on the other side of that? And you're going to see a lot more of those AI technologies being interwoven into the technologies to make use and sense of all the vast volumes of big data that's coming our way. So totally agree on that.
So I mean, when we have this lack of big data yet, and we actually work backwards in the production line, when you think about from the producers, the extractors, how do you think that could change, what they're growing, their patterns of extraction, their strains, as we think about ahead 10 years, is that going to change their demand cycles and what, they're growing and what they're producing, because they also don't have that meaningful insight yet into the patient's journey. How do you think, will that change the course of what is happening on the other side in 5 to 10 years time from now?
So there's this infinite series of permutations on how many cultivars we could breed and their effects. And so if we want to have the plant taken seriously as a medicine, to your point, we really need to be able to speak to this cultivar is going to have this specific effect, and that is how we argue for looser regulations, because the regulators are more comfortable when they can speak to specifically what this product does, what its purported risks are, and its associated benefits.
Yep, I agree. And if LPs don't look back at the data and the research that's coming about, we're here talking about technology, it doesn't really have any bounds, and what we're doing in the cannabis sector doesn't really differentiate from other sectors. So when you look back on companies that didn't look at the data and just built it and hope that they'd come, Blockbuster comes to mind. And so you build all these retail stores, you don't adapt the new technologies, and then by the time you realize you missed the boat, everybody's already left you on the new technologies. And so the last thing cultivators want to do is support 120 different strains when really, it's the 80-20 rule. What is the 20% that's driving 80% of my revenue? And so they'll go down to 30, 15, and 10. But they'll always be selling out of those 10 because, to your point, it'll actually hit the mark on what people are wanting in terms of effects for that strain. So absolutely, data, AI, and the use of big data should play a big part if LPs want to stay ahead of the curve in 2019.
And I was going to say, on top of that, we have to be particularly emphatic on pushing the LPs, and they know this too, but standardized products is number one thing. We can't even talk about standardized effects until we have standardized products. The range in these cultivars coming out of the LPs is still quite high, and it's a tough business to be in. You're not growing agricultural goods as you would tomatoes, where you walk into a Shoppers Drug, or a Loblaws today, you'll see tomatoes of different hues, different sizes. But we are trying to grow tens of thousands of plants so they are identical. That's very difficult, and so the shift towards finished goods is a good thing for us because we can speak to standardized pharmaceutical grade products, but we need to get there first before we can talk about standardized effects.
Today, if we could go back to 2014, we'd be hopeful to say we would have been helpful to be able to help advance some of the time and efforts taken for the Canadian market to get caught up to where it is. Our clinics in the U.S. see about 65,000 patients a year for cannabis evaluations, and that's not a small number, but that's nowhere nearly as large as the potential market size of patients could be. So ask me today if we have a lot of data and if we would have thought we would have had this much data. Probably not, because at the time we were a Canadian company looking at the Canadian market. But at the same time, I'm sure in a few years from today, I'll probably still say the same thing.
Is it still, I was going to say, is it still the same obstacles and challenges that you faced 5 years ago in terms of the clinic's medical professionals, utilizing and understanding the net tangible benefits to their end clients? Is that still the obstacle and challenge you're facing, or?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even in a market as mature as Canada, less than, I think, 20% of doctors prescribe cannabis, and I'd say less than 5% of that number prescribe more than one prescription for a patient. So you've got, 5% of the doctors writing 80% of the prescriptions in the country, and in a market as matured as Canada is, and even when we have lifted the stigma of cannabis through federal regulation, it's helping. Things are moving and they're advancing, but Canada's one country, and you've got jurisdictions around the world that are coming online, and it doesn't seem to have made that same impact that we could have learned from these experiences. So I don't think that this is a near-term battle. I think that eventually it'll get there. There's a quote by Dr. Gawande from the Checklist Manifesto. He says, it takes 17 years for a new protocol to get fully adopted by healthcare. I think maybe for each country that expands to cannabis, I think we're quite a ways away before we get to that point. It's going to be a battle, but you know what? We're trying to do our part. So
I think the big catalyst is legalization. I mean, there's so many ramifications of that. The fact that you now have a pathway to ROI on research, so you can more easily fundraise. There's the reputational risk that some scientists or researchers were worried about, and now they feel like they can actually research cannabis, and this is taken just as a whole more seriously. I mean, if we're going to embark on this grand social experiment, we should measure its effects. And so I think that it has been a massive catalyst for people thinking, okay, well, we're about to set out on this ocean of unknown, we should make sure we've got the lifeboats ready.
Yeah, and I think it's the lack of data that gave us all the opportunity to form the companies. And to your point, whether Canada starts to look like, oh, I think we have enough data, well, Germany's on board, then Australia, then other jurisdictions around the world where, wait a second, they were Canada 5 years ago. So now there's even more of a larger data opportunity there. And then you start doing the globalization of data where you're saying, well, how does an athlete differ in Germany versus Toronto and Vancouver? Well, what should I look like? How do I market to them? What type of strains or method of ingestions are right for them? And you start globalizing all that data, and that'll continue to be the opportunity for us.
Just as we're about to wrap up, just kind of finish up one or two last questions. Do you think that the lack of global cohesion, let's call it, around regulation has been the biggest impediment to data? Like collection, just overall, just different regulatory frameworks throughout the world, different ones coming up to speed. Every 6 months there's another country adopting from a medical perspective. It's interesting in the pharma world, you never kind of see that, right? Where you have a lack of cohesion globally on just accepted medical practices. Do you think this is one of the biggest impediments to growth so far?
Well, I think your last point makes sense. You never really introduce a product in the pharma world without having all the necessary evidence behind it to actually educate in a standardized way. And cannabis just isn't fitting that mold. I think global cohesion could help. Is it happening? Not necessarily. I think even within the states, for example, we put out a data report just to show the difference between where conditions actually are to where state regulations are actually basing conditions for cannabis on. I think there's so much to learn within a market that is one nation by itself. I'll let my panelists here speak more to this as they look at data externally from more of a retail perspective as well. But I think that there's not enough work being done to actually create lessons learned in the space that each market can learn from.
I agree, and it's the data disruption that the industry is going through that is the biggest opportunity for data companies in the space. And the more that we pull together, perform networks, share data, provide analysis of different countries, it's going to turn up new questions we're not thinking about today. And that's the biggest opportunity with the data disruption.
Yes, I think standardized regulatory frameworks are key. So, I mean, Europe is moving that way. The European Parliament just passed a draft resolution on December the 11th. They're trying to essentially offer a framework for any of their member states that actually want to move ahead with medical cannabis. And that's a reflection of the fact that they're looking and see, we've got 21 countries, all of whom have legalized some form of medical cannabis and all of whom are doing it differently. That is not a great way of rolling out a medical program across an entire region like Europe. So as frameworks are put in place that get bigger and more standardized, eventually it'll not be region specific, it'll be global. And I think that'll be a great way for having standardized data across the world.
Great, so I think we're actually just out of time now, but I want to thank our three panelists. Can't wait to have this same panel in 10 years right here. We're all going to be right here, so look forward to a decade from now talking about the global framework and how there is cohesion. I just want to thank the three of them. I think all three of your companies will be around for the next 2 days, so come feel free to meet them throughout CanTech. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.